thank you very much for the invitation. And yeah, it's great to see what you, well, it's great what you have set up is the Culture and Values seminar, Flamen. So thank you for doing this. And yeah, just going to share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
I'm nodding. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, today the title of my talk is The Benefits of Reporting Similarities when Comparing Countries and Other Groups of People, basically. Just moving the Zoom panel out of the way. All right. So at the beginning, I'd like you to imagine you are going to a conference to a country. Assume this is a country where you have never been and you know very little about. So you arrive there on the day before the conference, in the afternoon or so. So, and you decide in the evening to go to a pub to have a beer. You go to a pub on the first day, to one pub, but the beer that you get looks quite watery and quite different than the beer what you get in at least Western countries. If you don't like beer, just imagine it's sake or any beverage you like, and you taste it, and it actually tastes quite watery. It's not only looking like mostly water, but it's actually tasting quite watery. So you're curious why this is the case, and you observe the bartender, and you see the bartender is only pouring around 20% beer into the glass and topping it up with water. So basically around 80% of what you got is water, the other 20% are beer, which you find quite weird, but you're polite and just accept that this is probably just a tradition in this country. So it's done. But on the next day, so after the first day of the conference, you go to a second pub. At the second pub, because you were hoping to get, more beer, less water, and indeed it looks a little bit less watery, but it's actually still only 31% beer and 69% water, roughly. So which is better than the first pub, but still on the third day, you decide to go to a third pub, hoping again you would get more beer, but actually the opposite is the case. It's only 8% beer. So at this point, you are asking the bartender why this is the case, and why this information, how much beer you end up getting, is not openly available somewhere, at the door of the pub or online. And the bartender tells you, is a bit surprised by your question, because nobody actually really cares in this country how much beer you get. They just accept if you go somewhere, it's kind of a bit random, whether you get 8% beer or 31%, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. But he tells you, oh, if you're interested in it, you can just go to our online website, and there's a document available where you can see, or some of the documents contain how much beer each pub has, but for each document, for each pub, you need to pay, because the document is behind a paywall, and you need advanced knowledge in chemistry to figure out how much beer you're actually getting. So, which is probably not the best solution, but it seems like how it is in this weird country. No, so kind of, you might have, gotten by this analogy so far, where I'm using 8, 20, and 31%. If not, we are getting to it in one of the next few slides. So what I'm doing is, in my talk, is I currently kind of briefly review current practices of reporting our research findings, focusing on simple between subject designs with 2 groups. Then I discuss briefly some effect sizes to estimate similarities, give an example that demonstrating that similarities outweigh differences, show why highlighting or presenting similarities can be beneficial, and end with some recommendations also, especially for cross-cultural research. So the current practice is, well, we describe significant findings, right? We focus on differences, so 90 to 100% of the findings, so I guess above 90% are significant, no matter the design. And for cross-cultural research, actually quite a lot of research that focuses actually on similarities. So it's only 1 to 7, the ratio of research that focuses on differences compared to similarities or commonalities. If you look at gender, it's much more the difference, much bigger the gap. So there's some research that focuses on similarities, but the majority of cross-cultural research focuses on differences. And so how we usually communicate the findings in the abstract, for example, in our statement, something like this: Japanese are more collectivistic than Americans. Leave voters, so leave voters of the Brexit referendum from 2016, those people who voted, the people who voted in favor of leaving the European Union, that the UK leaves the European Union, and they are perceived or kind of portrayed as more racist than Remain voters, for example. Or women more than men prefer automates with financial prospects. Or liberals and conservatives rely on different sets of moral foundations. And all those ways of presenting or summarizing or research findings imply that both groups, so Japanese Americans or women or men, that they are distinct. So there's also some research from cognitive psychology that supports this distinction, but also some of the research I'm going to present you, so that we present research like Japanese are more collectivistic than Americans, that people understand it in a way that both groups are quite different from each other. And obviously it means that we present the findings in a binary fashion, which is in line with the so-called binary bias, which was, for example, there's a paper by Fisher and Kale in 2018 who found that this binary bias, so the tendency to impose categorical distinction on continuous data, is something what many people like to do, and clearly also researchers. But what we usually ignore is overlap or similarities. And there's a lot of research on, some research, interestingly, mostly by female researchers, by women who focus on gender similarities, like Janet Hyde or Donna Many. And I think in cross-cultural research, we might be able to learn 1 or 2 things from how research from the research on gender similarities and their rationales for it. And so I'm partly drawing on their rationales on the work of on the work on gender similarities. So what we could do instead of focusing on just this categorical distinction between, for example, between women and men. So like Donna Many put it, we need to ask how much sexes differ, not whether or not they are do. So kind of just trying to quantify a potential difference. But then the question is, aren't groups different if we get a significant p-value? And now, I mean, this is often, I think, a misconception that if we run a t-test, we are not testing whether groups are different, we are testing whether the means are different. So if you look at the formula, so the most important bit is basically the nominator, so the difference between the 2 means, and the expression under the square root and the square roots, both of them, is, to put it simply, tells us a little bit about the distribution of the means, but not about the distributions of the groups. So kind of, if you do a t-test, we compare groups, not means, and the effect size that is mostly used for between subject designs, counts t, is yeah, basically like it is like a t-value, but ignores is not impacted by the sample size, as the t-value is. So if we do a t-test, we actually comparing whether means are different, not whether groups are different. And so instead of so to answer the question, what we should do instead is, I think there are several effect sizes which are more balanced, and more informative to people. So count D is difficult for people to understand, standardized mean difference. Many people don't know really what it is. But if we were to use some of the other effect sizes, like count U3, the percentage of overlap, or the probability of superiority, so they are slightly more informative. In this talk, I'm going to focus on the percentage of overlap, so as a measure of similarities. So in this graph, you can see the count D of 0.21, which is approximately more or less, give or take, the average effect size in social psychology corrected for publication bias. You see that count D of 0.21 represents or is equal to, still means that the groups are 91.6% similar, or there's 91.6% overlap between both groups. In the so there are different methods to quantify similarities. So what I'm kind of using in my research usually is the basically extension of the overlapping coefficient, which ranges between 0 and 1, and I just multiplied it by 100, and sometimes call it overlapping coefficient, sometimes call it percentages of common responses, and a percentage of common response or overlap of 50% is what you get if count D is 1.34. And just to visualize the usual threshold, so if you have a count D of 0.2, it still means the groups are 92% similar, 92% overlap between both groups. For count D of 0.5, we get 80% similarities, and even for a so-called large effect size of 0.8, we have 69% similarities. So there now you get the 8, 20, and 31%. Beer that we had earlier in the example. So those are kind of the differences we usually, we often refer to as small, medium, or large. And now the question is kind of, if we apply this to groups, how similar are groups? Because often if you look at group comparisons in published literature, people have the tendency to focus on variables where they expect to find a difference. So basically, like Klaus Fiedler put it once, that so the biggest publication bias is, or one of the biggest and often ignored publication bias, is that we select our variables and our groups based on where we expect to find differences. Right? So I think it's important to do some analysis that tries to ignore those, tries to reduce this bias by focusing on many variables. But first, briefly discuss some other research. So there's a lot of research based on values that found that there are substantial similarities between groups already. So value hierarchy is mostly universal, like Sean Schwartz and Anna Bardi found, and which was then later extended by Ronald Fisher and so Sean Schwartz in 2011. And Janet Hyde has argued, or actually found in a second order meta-analysis, that women and men are mostly similar for all the variables she investigated. And also in subsequent research, she was able to replicate those findings. And what I did in my research is I focused on comparing countries religious denominations, income classes, women and men, people of different age groups, education levels, and tested how similar or different they were in terms of their values, attitudes, and beliefs. So what I did in one of the studies, I used data from the World Values Survey, sixth wave. Assume many of you are familiar with this data set. So I used a version that had at the time had 86,000 participants from 60 countries, and it contains many variables. And I picked the variables. So first, I focused on, I compared people from 60 countries, people from different age groups. So, and when I said comparing people from different age groups, it's across all countries. So I compared the age groups, the youngest, basically 10% to with all the other age groups. So with the other decentiles, so including the oldest 10%. Gender, just focusing on women and men. So it's just one comparison. For income, there were 10 groups, so relative to the country average. Education, there were 9 groups, and religious denomination, 8 groups. So I've focused on the religious denominations with at least 1,000 participants. And again, for each of those categories, it was across all the other categories. So for focusing on countries was obviously across age, gender, income, education, and religious denomination. So just focusing on countries. And in the comparisons, I did pairwise comparisons of each country. For 60 countries, it's many comparisons. For I forgot the exact number, but for age, it's, for example, 55 comparisons, I believe. If we compare the youngest age group with all the other 9, then the second youngest age group is the other older 8 ones, and so on. So in the end, I did in the study over 100,000 pairwise comparisons, also across all the variables, and focused on 22 variables, so 11 factors. So I just did some preliminary or simple fact principal component analysis to identify components such as trust in people participants were familiar with, trust in strangers, understanding of democracy, and so on, and 11 single items like political attitudes, and the 10 value items from Schwartz. I replicated the findings from using data from the European Social Survey, and the results were pretty similar. And the results were, so across, for example, countries, all the pairwise comparisons, the average, and across all of the variables, what we found was that countries are 80% similar, religious denominations 88% similar, and for income, education, gender, and age, the similarities exceed 90%. On average, and I think this is also aligns also that countries are relatively less similar compared to the other groups, aligns with research from Schwartz and also more recently Plamen. But I've replicated this in using different data, for example, Leave and Remain voters of the Brexit referendum, which has been where people are believed to be quite polarized. So UK is sometimes perceived as becoming more polarized, partly because of Brexit. Some people thinking Brexit was a great thing, others thinking, it was a quite dumb thing. And so that, leavers and remainers have been calling each other, not the nicest things, including leavers have been called racist, for example. And what we did here is we compared leavers and remainers, tested how similar they are. And what we found were kind of for universalism and security values, for example, again, high overlap, usually around 85 to 90%, depending on the sample. And for British identity, we again find high similarities, and even for feelings towards immigrants, which can be used as a measure of prejudice, we still found 51% similarities. So meaning that you often also have Remain voters who don't feel overly positive towards immigrants, but you also have Leave voters who feel fairly positive towards immigrants. And you can also find this for Democrats and Republicans for values, large overlaps between even for values, for traditional values, we find the relatively smallest percent of 54% similarities. So the mean differences are usually in the expected directions, right? We kind of expect that Republicans score higher in tradition values, Democrats lower, whereas we expect, for example, that in universalism, Democrats score higher than Republicans, but the main message here, I think, is that they are still more similar despite being perceived as highly polarized. They're still perceived, there's still some substantial overlap, and there's some other research finding that focusing on attitudes that Democrats and Republicans overestimate the difference by a factor of 2. So they perceive themselves as to be substantially more polarized than they actually are. And now to the next question, next part of the talk. So the impact of presenting similarities. So why does it matter? Why should we care about similarities? And I feel sometimes the perception is that if we report statistics, we just report it without focusing too much, without thinking too much about the implications of reporting statistics. But if we kind of focus on, where to focus more on similarities rather than differences, it could have a positive impact. So first, it would make effect size estimates more accurate. So if we just report differences, people overestimate the differences. If we report similarities, people get it much better in telling us or in understanding the actual effect size. So they don't overestimate the amount of similarities. They don't overestimate the differences, and it can also improve intergroup attitudes and reduce stereotypes if we focus more on similarities rather than differences between groups. So one example was in one study we had values of British versus Polish people. So we used data from the European Social Survey, I think wave 7, I believe, or wave 8. So large samples, and we presented the values, the same data, in 3 different ways to participants. So either focusing on similarities, like left graph, focusing on a bar chart with restricted y-axis, which is still the most common way. In 2018, I did a literature review of a few hundred papers, and truncating the y-axis was still preferred option. When presenting using the truncated y-axis, I need to say that we always inform participants that this response scale was actually from 1 to 6. The actual response scale 1 to 6, but this didn't have much of an impact. So this was ignored, and in the third condition, we presented bar charts with the full range of the y-axis, and so in this study we had 251 British citizens take part, and they saw between subject, so either type of graph for all of the 10 value types, Schwartz, and they answered some questions. How similar are the values of British and Polish people? How easily can they get along? And we used also inclusion of the other in the self scale, following using 7 pairs of circles. And what we find is that if we use the restricted bar plots, so the one on top left, then the amount of similarities was really underestimated. So it's actually around something between 85 and 90%. I forgot the exact figure. But if we use the unrestricted bar plot or the normal distributions, people are more likely to get it right. And if we, for example, use how well do you think British and Polish people get along with each other? By the way, I focused on Polish people because they're the largest immigrant group in the UK, or second largest, depending on which statistic, which source you're looking at. So getting along with each other. Also, bar plots believe that British and Polish people wouldn't get as well along with each other than if we use the overlapping normal distributions. So, and the overall evaluation of Polish people was more positive when we highlighted the similarities on average. And we replicated this in Leave and Remain voters, Liberal and Conservatives in the US, so that highlighting similarities or religious and non-religious versus atheists or non-believers, and also some other studies, and we consistently found that highlighting similarities helps to reduce or improves attitudes, only on some measures, not on all measures, but it usually helps to improve the attitudes towards the other group, towards the outgroup, like makes conservatives perceive Republicans or liberals more positive and vice versa, for example. And more recently, I focused on similarities between women and men. So to extend some my previous research, because some of the previous studies were relatively small. But in this study, used almost age and gender representative samples from the UK and US. And over 2,200 participants. And I presented them findings from the most recent PISA study, in which PISA is the program of international student assessment, every 3 years. In, I think the last time it was 79 countries. So, and in the 15-year-old students took part, or students attending British schools. And in the US, were 5,000 participants, almost 5,000 15-year-old students who took part and were assessed on mathematics, science, and readings, and there were tons of other questions in it. And I just presented the same results in 7 different ways. So in one condition, for example, I presented the data visual difference condition. I presented the bar plots with truncated y-axis, displaying only the means for girls and boys, like what you see in the top right chart. Then the text difference conditions, I just highlighted that participants, that the PISA study found differences between boys and girls, which is accurate, right? They're mostly significant, statistically significant. Then I also Googled or looked at some newspapers or blog posts, how they summarized the results. And many of them said, oh, there are differences between girls and boys. Others said, oh, there are small differences. So I thought, okay, what happens if we just say there are small differences? Then we had a control condition. Then text balance conditions. So we read that the participants read that girls and boys performed similarly on mathematics, readings, and science, but there were some minor differences. For example, only some girls performed better in reading than the average boy. Visual balance condition, so just superimposing normal distributions, like what you can see on the bottom right-hand side. So again, the same data, top right-hand side and bottom right-hand side. And I had a 7th condition, visual and text balance condition. So we used the overlapping normal distributions, but added the percentages of overlap, percentages of similarities between both groups. So skipping this one in interest of time. So we asked them, participants, how similar boys, and also we asked them stereotype-related questions. So boys have higher math abilities than girls. What we found, for example, how similar are girls and boys. So if we highlight similarities, of course, like we see in the right-hand corner, we see large amount of similarities than if we focus on differences. So how similar boys and girls, right? So 0, they're completely different. 100, they are identical. So if we focus on differences, kind of it reduces the amount of perceived similarities. If we focus on similarities, it usually increases it, except for compared to the neutral control condition. And I think this one is also interesting. So kind of the endorsement of stereotypes that boys are better in mathematics than girls. So all the difference conditions resulted in higher means, so kind of more endorsement of the stereotype than the similarity conditions. Right, so kind of for really reporting out compared to the control condition, similarities are not doing anything, but talking about differences really enhances the stereotypes. Yeah, skipping this one, just moving on to the discussion. So what I hope I've shown that a balanced portrayal of the research findings that highlight similarities alongside differences can have positive effects on stereotypes and views of the other gender. And the effects are mainly consistent, so across countries. So we did also research in Brazil and India using pen and paper versions, partly also online samples, and we were mostly able to replicate the findings. So it's not just limited to Western countries. And if we add textual information, so if we add figures like 90% similarities, 95% similarities, it makes the effects even stronger. But what we were not able to find is any impact after 2 weeks. So we had a subset of the participants in one sample come back after 2 weeks, but there was nothing left, which is in line with, I think, all the other research I've read on on exposure to one-shot manipulations. Okay, so I think it's important to focus on similarities alongside differences. We can use visualizations, but we don't have to, and we should avoid truncating the y-axis. And talking about truncating y-axis, so often how we present the results in cross-cultural research is it's never really clear to me whether how much we truncate the y-axis. So we kind of present countries as just the average. We ignore the within-country variability, or kind of don't present any y-axis, like Schwartz did in his paper on cultural value orientations. And what I think is what we discussed in our 2019 paper was what happens, so kind of what are the implications for the definition of culture. So we proposed a definition of groups of individuals belong to a different culture if they are more different than similar on a specific variable. So similarities is lower than 50%. We can also make it more strict and focus on different measures of similarities rather than this one I'm proposing, or I've been discussing here. This is just a minor point here. So, for example, participants from Pakistan differed in their moral attitudes towards personal sexual issues such as abortion or homosexuality from participants from Sweden, right? But for many other variables like Schwartz values, there were more similarities than differences between Pakistanis and or people from Pakistan, people from Sweden, right? So the conclusion could be in this example that participants from Pakistan belong to a different culture when it comes to attitudes towards personal sexual issues, but not regarding to many other variables. So kind of just this binary distinction, how kind of they are different. We focus on we cherry pick a few variables. We find there are differences, or potentially large differences, like between Pakistan and Sweden. There was, I think, the const was around 3, so pretty large effect size. But in many other things, if we focus on other variables, we find more similarities, and therefore kind of could conclude that they don't belong to a different culture when it comes to values or attitudes towards violence, for example. Okay, thank you. And I also want to thank my collaborators, Greg, Lucas, Tony, Laura, and Martha.